We are getting started on the thought leadership part 2 of our 3-part series that we're doing on a variety of different aspects of board readiness. Last time we talked about the prelude leading into the actual networking your way into the board. We talked about what to look for on a board, things that matter for you. We had a great set of panelists. One of those is joining us today again, Mr. Daniel. And the panelists shared their personal stories about their journeys of how they found their boards, how they got onto the boards, questions to be asking, what's in it for you and what's in it for them, what you should be thinking about of what you can offer and what you can bring. Today, we're going to go another step deeper into the whole conversation, and we're going to be talking with Shelley Ford about the actual networking part. I know you guys are going to really just love what we're up to. Next time, we're going to talk about the 3 tips to building your irresistible board resume. Having a board resume, while it may not be something that you actually hand out, but when you have a board resume, what it does for you is it solidifies in your own mind what your talking points are, what your key attributes are for a board, and it makes you get your conversation and your talk track very succinct. So it's an important part in this whole process, even if you don't end up actually using it. But every person who gets onto, especially paid board positions, will tell you that they did create a board resume. And then there's about a 50-50 chance that you would use that board resume. So keep that in mind, vitally important. It is definitely different than a traditional resume. So stick with us for next time to find out exactly what you should have on that board resume. So today we're talking about networking your way into a board role. And we're going to cover these 3 points: 5 steps to network onto a board. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some really key pieces that almost everybody asks, getting past gatekeepers as a part of this, and then what to say to create urgency. Most of us, as we do networking of any sort, we struggle with how do we get them to move things forward, whoever it is that the we that we're talking to. So that's what we're going to talk through today. And I'm going to take a moment to introduce my dear friend, Shelley Ford. She has an amazing background in the business side of the world, and with 15 years of business development, i.e. relationships, networking, queen of this stuff, and also a whole lot of CMO experience. So both the marketing and the sales side is truly her core gifts and skills. And she happens to work at Morgan Stanley as a financial advisor, does amazing work there, not only with individuals, but also with company business leaders in helping with benefits and a whole slew of things there that I encourage you to get in touch with her as an individual, just to talk about some of the things that are changing in the marketplace and how you might benefit from the combination of things going on in business, in your business, if that's, related to it, and in your personal side of it. So let's give a warm welcome to Shelley. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. Thanks, Patrice. I'm excited.
So we have a disclaimer here. I want to point out to everybody, the views here expressed are those of the author, me mostly, and a little bit of Shelley, only where Shelley says it, and are not necessarily a reflection of Morgan Stanley and their wealth management and its affiliates. So you may not hold this against them. Okay, to kick this off, as we often do, we're going to jump into our breakout rooms. And I want you guys to share out your name, what your one superpower is, the thing that you do best. It may not be your title, where it may not even have necessarily something to do with your current work, but it is the thing that people know you for doing this, whatever this is, that this is what you are, what most people who know you would say about you, similar to how I introduced Shelley. Shelley is brilliant as a financial advisor, but her superpowers in that role is actually around her networking skills and her marketing message. Like, she has nailed that stuff. And I want you guys to share along with that, why do you want to be on a board? This is an important question for us to be answering today. And then what is your biggest challenge of networking onto a board? So the one thing that's holding you back from your perspective, think of the biggest thing that you feel is holding you back from getting onto a board. All right, so we're going to open up our rooms here. So Shelley, you want to walk us through some of these amazing stats that you have pulled together here for us?
So basically, if you take a look at the board positions right now on LinkedIn, now, of course, this is nationally. We have 22,000 board positions right now on LinkedIn. And when I actually did this research, it was literally last week or the week before, and there was 1,533 new positions posted just in that day. So the average pay for a board member position, I believe that was $47,000, about $47,000. So we had a couple folks in our room say, hey, this would be really great for us to be able to retire and still get a little income and give back to the companies or the nonprofits or whatever that we'd like to work for. So there is ample opportunity for board positions. And while I know that you guys must have talked about last time, in order to find your name on a digital search, you have to have a C-level. That is not really the case when you're networking your way into a board position. So like I'm a vice president, and I think it all depends on what company you're working for, right?
Yeah. And I'm talking about public boards specifically. If you want to be on a publicly traded company board, I am not aware of anybody who sits on those boards that doesn't have that C-suite title previously in their history of their work, and even more specifically at large corporate. So if you were in smaller startups and you didn't get over, say, 100 million or something, 500 million in annual revenues in the companies that you were sitting on, so brand names of some level, I'm not familiar with those people getting that type of person being able to get onto boards that are publicly traded company boards. And a lot of that has to do with the risk that comes with it. And so there's a whole lot more fiduciary responsibility and ergo risk that comes with it. So step one in your 5 steps, Shelley, tell us a little bit about this.
The why behind joining a board is really key. And I want everyone to start thinking about not just, hey, do I want to join a board? And if so, let's just throw our name in the hat. It really needs to be very specific. So for instance, Anne talked a lot about her ability to go to market with new products. So what she's probably going to be needing is to think about board prospects who are maybe not, either large companies that have new product offerings that are coming on board, earlier stage companies, or maybe a nonprofit that's looking at pivoting. So the why behind joining a board is actually really important, because you can't just go, look, 22,000 LinkedIn boards, I'm just going to throw my name in the hat and hope that works, right? So being very specific in what you're looking for to achieve on a board is going to be really helpful. And then I think one of the most important parts of this, and we'll talk about the urgency later, is what problems are you trying to solve? So for us personally, joining a paid board means an additional income stream, maybe a source for retirement. That's terrific, but the company and the board don't care, right? We really have to research those organizations, understand what difficulties they're going through right now, and be able to really help solve using your skill sets. I think we all get approached to volunteer. Even nonprofit volunteer work needs to set in with that goal of where we want to be 2 years from now. Does that make sense?
Definitely. So I'm going to poke at that a little bit with some more questions that have come up previously on this topic around the why. Shelley, from your perspective in your own journey, I wanted to have you share a little bit about your board journey, because you've been on a couple of different boards, and I know you've been on some other ones previously. Tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe share an example from your own background about how you chose to get onto one board versus another.
For me personally, the paid position that I was in before Morgan Stanley was primarily because my dad had peripheral neuropathy. So I had a personal impact with that. And so that was years and years ago. I have served on the Colorado Public Television Board for about 12 years and looking to jump off that now because I'm ready to do something new and different. And I was actually approached for that one. So that was an incredible experience, but I think that the paid board positions are harder to get, but they're no different than a sales position for me right now. So let's take just an example of me trying to work in with the CEO. I have to really research that CEO, understand what their issues are, and then that's how I approach them. So being on a paid board is almost no different than paying yourself for your career, if that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely. On the PBS board, what was it that you were able to bring to that board as example? What were some of the superpowers that you shared with that board?
So I think, and Dominic can probably attest to some of this, but I think my skill sets are really in marketing. So we did a strategic marketing basically project. It took us a while to get there. And we also, frankly, I really think our board needs to be shook up a little bit. Like we need to get some more people on the board that have some new and different ideas. And so I think that when you look at, nonprofits and organizations that have been around for a very long time, sometimes we get stuck in our old way of thinking. And so maybe what you're bringing to the board is this whole new idea, which can be kind of scary. And it's kind of like, okay, how are we going to do that? But in the end, it might, really help service the organization.
Really great point. Yep. I had a similar experience in starting in on a foundation board for a church in which we needed to do something really drastic and pull funds out of the church and put them into a different kind of entity for protection of the church and where they were going next, and making sure that others couldn't get into the rather large assets that they had, which was a very scary thing for everybody because, of course, you're taking money out of our entity and you're putting it somewhere else. Are we going to be out of control with that? And how's that going to work? And who gets to make the decisions about how that money gets used if it's somewhere else? So, yep, very tricky situations, bringing in new things, but also very fun. So let's talk a little bit about types of organizations. Shelley, walk us through the various kinds that you're familiar with and pros and cons or advice on these.
Okay, so guys, I'm really excited about this part because I think that there is this misconception that you have to be on a large company, private board, or a public corporate board in order to get paid. That's absolutely not the case, okay? So advisory boards is something that you all talked about last time. Oftentimes very early stage companies, startup businesses, and there's a couple of ways that you can get paid on these boards, okay? Number one, you can volunteer your time for stock. And if you really believe in the type of startup business or the kind of company that they are, you can actually, it's basically like your sweat equity. You do get paid as an advisory board member. Oftentimes, even in earlier stage companies, if they're just beginning their revenues, they are willing to pay advisors for your advice. So if you have that kind of experience and you know that you can help this kind of earlier stage startup company, don't be afraid to think that, hey, I'm going to get paid for this, because you probably will. Okay? And there's a couple of resources where you can actually find out about the information about the company. Now, remember, step one is, why do I want to join a board? So that means you need to start listing out major, the companies that you want to work for. If you decide you want to be an advisory board member, look at those earlier stage companies through lists of companies like Colorado Business Journal. We'll talk about this later as well. The Denver Startup Week, they publish all the companies that are on there. You can go to Patrice's former Thai Rockies and look at the list of companies that are listed there as well. Some of them are very mature. But I want to make sure everyone knows that you can get paid as an advisor. And in fact, a lot of people will pay more for these advisors because you're so needed in these positions. So once you've discovered the companies that we're looking for, and the whole idea here is you cast a wide net and you find 5 companies that you're targeting. Okay, so our idea is to find 5 companies with 20 individuals that we're really going to focus on. So 5 companies and 20 individuals. So 4 individuals with each company. So now we can kind of go back to the advisory board, because I want to tell you guys where you can find information about those companies. So you've got Crunchbase, you've got ZoomLink, you've got basically Zoom Info, Hanover Research. So if you're I'm just giving you ideas on how to research these types of companies. So once you've selected your 5 companies, there's a ton of areas that a lot of people aren't familiar with that you can start to get to know names of individuals, perhaps how much revenue they're generating. You might want to look for companies that have, say, $1 million or more in revenue, just so you know that they can afford you. Okay? That's just a good idea. Nonprofit boards. Again, like I said, in Colorado alone, we have 21,000 nonprofits. 21,000 nonprofits. So the Colorado Nonprofit Association is a great place to just hook yourself in. That costs like $150 a year. It's absolutely a terrific place to start networking your way in to nonprofit. But there's another great place that you can start researching before you even do that. So let's assume that you'd like to be paid on a nonprofit. There's something called a Form 990. If you have not ever taken the chance to take a look at this, it's a terrific resource. Every single nonprofit in the state of Colorado or in the country, maybe it's not in Colorado, has to actually file a Form 990 with the government. Basically, what these nonprofits are doing is they have to say how much revenue they're earning. They have to say how much goes to staff versus how much goes to the cause. and they have to list their board of directors. So this is a great way to be able to see the entire board of directors. You might know one of them. You might be able to attach to Patrice's software, and she might know someone, right? When you get that list of directors through the Form 990, it's a pretty easy way to start meeting people. Also, GuideStar is another great resource. It's totally free. It does the same kind of information, and it allows you to see everything that's going on within a nonprofit. It's also a great resource if you're trying to look for a problem, and that's one thing we'll talk about with regards to urgency. You can kind of research their revenues have been going down year over year, or, they've hired 50 more people, but what's happening? It's a great way to be able to look up, almost like you can with a public corporation. Private boards. Larger private boards are a little tougher to break into because they're pretty well established. However, you can find information on them, believe it or not, through the Library of Congress. So some of these larger private boards, privately held companies that are big, I can give you a good example of one, would be like a CH2M Hill. They're now owned by Jacobs Engineering, and they are publicly traded. But for literally the first 40 years of their entire business base, they were a privately held company. And it was a huge company, billions of dollars. So you can look on Zoom Info and Library of Congress to see who is actually advising on this board. You can also look at their 401k plan, because that is also public domain. And you can kind of see who runs their 401k plan and really who makes the decisions on their 401k plan. That might be a good way to start. Public companies and corporate boards, it sounds like this group might not be aiming towards that, or you might really just pull the public financial reports. That's pretty easy to do. We don't have a ton of public companies here in Colorado, so those positions I would say are probably far and few between, but it doesn't mean you can't be paid in these other three areas.
Excellent points. I love it. And I think to your point about the advisory boards in the startup businesses, what we're talking about there is a combination of things. You may be doing some of your time as a board member, and you might get an equity position around that. You may also do some of your time in sort of a consultative thing where you're actually working on some deliverables and some projects with the leadership team of the company, and you can get paid for that. And then it can go even a step further, which is into being a fractional expert in your area of expertise, which is, an ongoing role, not just a kind of a short-term project base. So there's many different ways, to Shelley's point, about how to get compensation for the level of effort that you want to contribute. If it's just an hour a month, then you're probably not going to get that much. If you're contributing more than that, then you can look for that. I love these guides here. Also, inside of our training material in the accelerator, for those of you on our platform, we give you the links to get to another resource that is similar to Zoom Info's. I'm pretty sure that's paid now. It's you have to pay to get onto it. However, there is another Data Axle resource, which we give you step-by-step instructions of how to access that for free inside of our portal underneath of the training module around targeting your organizations. So make sure that you look at that if you're curious about this. And Shelley, I'm going to have to clearly augment my training materials with new updated sources and stuff. I love this. So finding the right people. This was a big question for everybody, or almost everybody. Let's walk through this in a little more detail.
Okay, so again, we're going to select 5 organizations, and we're really going to try and research those individuals. The sites that I've listed are very good to be able to find individuals' names, but let's maybe go to the next slide. So it's not too difficult to find the owner's name, or Colorado Biz Magazine posts lists of Colorado's top companies. You can almost always find the C-level. Finding the business owner of the C-level is not impossible, but then you need to start really researching. When I go out to meet with a pretty big deal person, I'm not just looking online and Google searching. I'm actually reading newspapers. I'm really focusing on things like the Denver Business Journal, Colorado Biz Magazine, anything that comes up where there's a highlight for that individual. I'm looking for those highlights, and I look for them every single week. I think that's the other thing, is that people think that this is going to be a quick and easy process. It does take time. And I won't say that you have to dedicate 10 hours a week to it. I think you can dedicate an hour and a half a week to it, to just researching the C-suite of individuals that you're trying to find. And it's pretty easy from there, but let's go to the LinkedIn part, Patrice, if that's okay. So you can see here that if you have the premium LinkedIn account, you can look up everything from companies, groups, jobs, posts, and people. Sounds kind of awful, but you're kind of like targeting these folks, right? So we want to get to know everything about them that we can. And premium LinkedIn will actually allow you to dig into some more information about them on the back end before you kind of start making that reach out and start making that phone call.
I'm going to just jump in on that a little bit more, and then we're going to open it up for questions as well. So again, if if you figure out a company, you look at the company's name. From the company name, you would select people. And once you have the company page up, and that's going to give you the list of people that are in the company. And then you can look to see who are you a first or a second connection to. When there is second connection, you can see who is the person that you are a second connection through. And so I might give a call to Jack or an email or a message to Jack to say, hey, Jack, I'm interested in talking with Nancy about what they're doing in their San Francisco office. Would you be comfortable making an introduction for me? And here is a quick blurb to share with her. And in the quick blurb, which again, in the platform, this is why we have you create these things ahead of time. So it becomes a copy paste exercise, not a, gosh, I have to sit here and spend 20 minutes thinking, what do I want to tell Nancy that Jack would then be able to send to her so he doesn't have to think about it either, so that I can actually get this introduction done. And so Jack, I might say, in my little template that I store in the platform underneath of the career assets, part of our portfolio assets, I might say name, comma, I'm interested in learning more about your background, and that this will be directed at Nancy. And I'm running a company that provides a software service. I'd like to learn more about how you guys are handling this and your particular background and view on this. And then that might be something that Jack can think about it, edit if he says, like, Patrice, they need to know this about you, and he'll add his own sentences, and then he can send that to Nancy. And so that's what we're talking about with this whole networking thing. But Shelley has a more direct approach than I do. I kind of go around the bend on things. So Shelley, if this was you and you were targeting, say, Nancy as the CFO in this particular company, what would you do with that?
So first of all, I'd know everything about Adipar that I could. Okay, so I'd pull up everything about Adipar and I'd go, okay, this is what they're doing really well. This is what they're not doing really well. And I'd have a really good pain point to discuss with them. Some kind of pain point. It's not hard to find one, folks. Every company has a pain point, right? So before I make any kind of phone call or any kind of anything, I have a reason to call them. It is not just to be like, hello, I'd like to have coffee with you, right? So number one, I'll offer to introduce, Carla Harris, pretty famous here at Morgan Stanley. She used to have something in her book, Pearls of Wisdom, do first, ask later. So the idea here is you do three things first for the company or the individual that you're trying to target, and then you ask them for your need, right? Like, hey, I'd really like to be introduced to someone on your board because I think I have a lot to offer, right? But you're not going to get that from a CFO until you have a lot to offer. So the first thing you do on LinkedIn is you offer to introduce them to someone who would help them with a cause, help them with whatever problem they have. If it is a CFO, it's pretty easy to come up with something financially driven that you could talk about. If it's a chief technology officer, you could look at basically the information on what they plan to do in their marketing strategy and see how technology is helping them accomplish that. Then give them a call and say, hey, how's that working? Right? Like, is that working for you? And if not, here's an idea. So when I offer to introduce other people via LinkedIn, I'm almost 80% or on the phone, and I often will do that. I'm 80% successful at getting either a phone call back or an email back by just offering to say, hey, I saw this newspaper article. I noticed that this is a challenge for you. I have a great resource for you. Would you mind having lunch with me? Of course, you want to be honest and forthright and give them good resources. So you have to have that resource. And if you don't, that's not the person you call, right? So number one is offer to make an introduction. Number two is the invitation. I personally like to do in-person meetings with as many people as I can. I think it makes a huge difference when you get to meet folks in person. By inviting people to an event, there is literally no harm, no foul, okay? I mean, let's just say an example. I have my chief officer basically doing an entire what's going on in the economy. I mean, kind of everybody wants to know what's going on in the economy. So you could introduce yourself to them by saying, hey, I heard about this great event. I thought it would be a terrific thing that you might enjoy coming with me to. Inviting people to an event, there is never any harm, no foul. Like no one's ever offended by that. Hey, I just saw that you were awarded this and I have a seat at this nonprofit event and I just thought it'd be great for us to connect. Would you like to be my guest? Without being too schwarmy about it, right? And then you really start connecting. And I will tell everyone here, I know I'm really direct, but I use the phone. So 90% of how I meet people is through the telephone. Pick up the phone, call them. And it's a huge differentiator. So for the Women's Foundation, I'm not on the board, but I'm a PEP member with them. We had, as an example, Michelle Obama come as a speaker, and you won't believe it. We just picked up the phone and asked, right? Like, that's all we had to do. Say, hey, would you be a speaker? And she was like, sure, right? It was in line with her desires and her needs to help women advance themselves. And so, again, I think it starts with targeting those individuals, really researching what it is that they need. I mean, it might be something as simple as you see on LinkedIn or in Google or something that they are on a soccer team or they're a soccer coach. And you're like, hey, my kid's on a soccer team. I'd like to get to know you better. It's really just that one thing in common or that one problem that you can solve that can get you to pick up that phone.
That's such a great point. And that's why we talk about those 7 areas of interest where you need to understand the 4 C's about the person, their college, their career, their children. As Shelley said, like that is such an emotionally great tie-in for people. We all love to talk about our kids, right? And then what is their charity or volunteer or, wherever they're giving back. And a lot of that information, again, on LinkedIn, you can find that about a person in the bottom part of their profile. You would be surprised. And also there's the groups. So when you are on a person's profile, you can look at the groups that they're associated with. It's very telling, who they are choosing to listen to, participate in, associate with. So great key points there. And now I know a lot of people are probably wondering the offline versus the online versions of this, Shelley. So tell us a little bit about why you would choose to get COBIZ or other hard copy things. What do you see as the difference in the hard copy versus the digital?
I just think it depends on how you all operate. Like I like to go through a magazine or newspaper and highlight people. And if I don't physically do that, then I'm not going to remember it, right? Looking at things online for me is like TikTok. I could care less, right? So I'm like, oh, that's nice, but I don't really care. When they send me these LinkedIn things like, oh, the such and such is an anniversary, I'm like, great, good job. I'll pay attention to the LinkedIn notifications when they say, hey, such and such left their job or got a new job. I'll be like, hey, congratulations, do you need help, right? But for the most part, online for me is really hard to follow, and I do put it into some kind of old antiquated Excel format so that I can kind of follow up with people, but probably just having your software would be better, Patrice. But I think that having the newspaper in front of you and reading the article about the person, it really does show that you've made an effort to do something more than just Google search them, because that takes like no time at all.
All right. And now the staying connected part. Let's talk about that a little bit.
So the staying connected is really, you really have to remember that out of the 20 people that you're targeting, you'll probably get meetings with 2 or 3, but it could take a year of dripping, right? It could take an entire year of calling, dripping, emailing, however it is that you want to do that. Again, I think that Patrice, your software kind of keeps people in check with what they need to do next, because it's kind of like a campaign reminder type of thing. But for me personally, just to get in front of people, I'm constantly creating myself as the center of influence. And I don't know if that's like number 5 here. Okay, so becoming irresistible to your board. So first of all, we talked a little bit earlier about not wanting to pay a lot of money to do this, but just like getting a job, getting on a paid board of directors takes effort and it might take a little bit of money. National Association for Corporate Directors is a terrific association that all of you should join if you're really interested in becoming a paid board member. Once you join, they'll have every kind of board feature out there. They have their own like internal hiring process, and you get to go to all their great networking events where you learn things like governance. Governance is pretty important. And if you don't understand governance on a board, you need to make sure you get that before you join a board or even really start looking at one. But you really want to be the center of influence in whatever it is that you're trying to show that you do. So whether that's creating events and inviting people to those events or writing articles, I personally signed up with a syndicate where I was in like 16 different newspapers at one point in time for some of the articles that I was writing about how to be a better startup company. So whatever it is that you are trying to achieve with this board position, you need to become the center of influence on that. And I think that's probably the most important part of staying connected. So you see this quote here, not following up with your leads is like filling a bathtub without a stopper. It's like, that's the truth, right?
Love that. The level of interest, being more personable, you use the phone. Tell us a little bit about an example of how that call might sound. Are you leaving voicemails? How are you addressing the fact that their assistant may be screening their calls for them? How does this using the phone thing work from your perspective?
So first of all, I think you had a question on there, Getting Through the Gatekeeper. There is a terrific book. I know we're all like crunched for time. It's called Selling to Veto, VITO. And that is basically 3 or 4 steps on how to get to know the gatekeeper and how to get through the gatekeeper. It's not very hard, guys. I mean, we all have gatekeepers here, right? And all you need to do is have a reason to get through the gatekeeper. And I will say, like I said, I'm so successful at getting through the gatekeepers just by picking up the phone and getting to know them. Like, hey, Sam, like the third time I call, hey, Sam, it's Shelly. I just want to see how you're doing. Every once in a while, like for Assistance Day, I'll send like bagels to folks and say, it's your friend at Morgan Stanley. And they'll be like, oh my gosh, that cheese ball person will not leave us alone. Eventually you'll get a meeting, right? But I will actually try to sidestep gatekeepers if I can. Nowadays, a lot of the companies have virtual directories, so it's pretty easy to leave an email or to leave a voicemail. Getting the email can be tougher, but there are some paid subscriptions that you can get emails of those people too. So I think you can do the voicemail and the email, and then anytime you can find any sort of celebration for that individual, send them a card, send them bagels, pizza, whatever. I mean, people are kind of shocked when you send them something like a little lunch. It's like, hey, congratulations, I saw you in the newspaper. I'm really successful at getting in front of people that way.
Yeah, we call that lumpy mail. Anytime you can send something that's lumpy, and boy, a lunch, wow, that would be quite amazing. One of the things Shelly does that if you get involved with her group, the Executive Women Connecting, one of the cool things she did was she has one of the women in the group who she, as a business owner, sells spices. And so Shelly decided to send out a spice mix. And then as a part of an event, we were then using some of the spices as part of the culinary experience and or beverage making experience. And so those kind of ideas, like a sending out of something, very, very memorable. Because to Shelly's point, nobody does it. It's a simple thing to do. And I guarantee you, it really does unlock the doors. So I want to take a moment and just open this up for a little bit of discussion. Dominic, we're going to go to you on that.
Question I would ask is narrowing down exactly what you can bring to the board. So, talking about you wanting to do something for them kind of thing. I think that resonated, Shelly. But how do you kind of determine exactly what you can bring so that you can do something for the company and making that networking work?
So Dominic, because I have the pleasure of knowing you and your skill set, I'm just going to highlight a couple things. Being a program manager for a small station and basically coming up with everything that had to be in order to generate revenue for your station, basically you were the crux. Honestly, you were it. Didn't really matter if you were C-suite or not. You should have been. And so you have to take that skill set and say, okay, look at other companies. Does it have to be in television? No. Does it have to be in radio? No. It could be for a different for-profit that needs some media attention. There's a lot of these for-profits, even smaller companies that are like, hey, I'm Flack or whatever, and I'm so great at my digital marketing, but then they really actually need media attention is what they need to get them boosted up to the next level. So what you need to do is think about your skill set and then kind of think about those companies, even nonprofits. My gosh, like, I don't know, like I keep coming up with for-profits like the Tom Socks or whatever, where they donate another sock. Like you have this nonprofit experience, and so many people now are into this ESG thing. Why not bring that nonprofit experience to a for-profit company and say, hey, I know how to do program. I know how to generate revenue for you. You need me on your board. Okay, so that's what you need to be thinking about.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Shelly. It's great.
So if he were to do that, and let's say pick one industry, Dominic, that you think outside of radio and TV type of things, what other industry might you target as a potential industry that you think you could help?
It's a great question. I've had this presentation has really helped me started to kind of expand my thinking to kind of the for-profit sector. I think for a while my head's been more in the nonprofit sector, but I think there's an intersection with the interest there, specifically in more of the, I guess, more of your nonprofit causes. My interest, and I think the community's interest in water issues is going to magnify, especially over these next 5 to 10 years. And perhaps there's a bridge to not just the nonprofit organizations trying to do something about it, but the for-profit organizations that are part of the solution, whether it's clean water management within a municipal system, or if it's broader. I've seen it go all the way from international to very hyper local. But I think that's probably where I have a passion for that. And I think there's got to be a link to what Shelley just said, to getting a message out there. Because I think in general, for the last 30 years, we think about clean water. It's like, well, I hope my water's clean, and you kind of take it for granted. Now, if we're going to be starting to think about real water management, what I can and can't do with my own water, that's suddenly becoming a much more important issue. And does that message need to get out to the public, even for a for-profit company that would help them in a more effective way? So that's probably.
So I have some ideas for you, Dominic, if that's okay.
Great. Absolutely.
So there's the Farmers Association that you should join here in Colorado. Huge organization. There's the Water Board. It's actually the Water Board itself, mostly attorneys, but they also have some privately held firms that are specifically dealing in water. There's multiple engineering companies that are dealing with this right now that are for profit, and oil and gas. Like, if we could get the oil and gas companies to pull up their water and clean it to potability and put it back in the rivers. And by the way, that can work because the Supreme Court Justice said it is available. We just haven't done it yet. So if that's something that you really want to get involved in, I would start with associations, then have kind of a proposal going to these different kinds of organizations, just as an idea.
Great idea. Thank you, Shelley. As always, you've been very supportive. Thank you.
And Colleen had another great place for you, which is the Water Center at CSU, the CSU Spur. So another great place. And then, Bruce, we're definitely going to cover that conversation about the liability and risks associated with board membership. So I wanted to use Dominic as an example of walking through these 5 steps that Shelley has talked about. So Dominic has his why. I want to give back, but I actually want to focus on something relevant to sustainability, and specifically in the area of water. So he might look at for-profit company boards, private companies that are in that space. And he might go to the Built in Colorado site as a starting point and find out what are the companies that are working on water sustainability. And of course, you can Google search that to begin with, and that's going to help you get there. And especially narrowing it down to Colorado will help you get there. And then Business Journal and other places that are doing that. Denver Startup Week is coming up right around the corner. Another great place to find out who the companies are that are doing these kinds of things. There's the Sustainability Alliance and all these different places. So he would pick his target, come up with the idea of what does he feel comfortable with in terms of size of company that he feels is a reasonable target. If he doesn't feel like a publicly held traded company is going to be, appropriate for him, what size company is appropriate? Does he want to start with, as Shelley said, like $1 million to $5 million, such that he could not only serve as a board member for potentially an equity position, but then also he might be there as a consultant to do some of the more detailed projects that he could help them with. So these are different ways. And then the next step that she says is, you got to ultimately reach out, connect, pick up the phone and talk to people. So once he found a few people, and Shelley was saying, at least 4 people within one company. So we've got there's a nonprofit that I know of that's the sustainability nonprofit that probably is looking for board members, but you might target 4 different people, a couple of them on the board, but also a couple of them that are, in the company's staff. And then per Shelley's, recommendation, you got to reach out to all of them, and you have to research each one to know what's something about each one of them that I might be related, and why might they choose to have a conversation with me, because we're going to talk about this thing that is of interest to them. So that's that next step. And Shelley keeps it on a sheet of some sort. You got to track it somewhere because you're going to make some phone calls. And then Shelley, about how long, if it were 4 people on I can't remember the name of that. It's Sustainability Alliance, I think. Do you know what this one I'm talking
I
about?
know it's not here. I do. I think I do. Is it with Stephanie Gripney? I can't remember.
No.
She might be a good one too.
But yeah,
I don't. Anyways, so I will tell you, there have been people that I've had on my Excel spreadsheet for 10 years, and one day I'll get them, right? So I think you have to be realistic in the timing. I will tell you that joining associations, $200 a year, going to meetings and networking with people at those associations, now that we're kind of back to in-person meetings again, is not a bad idea. It's so much easier to kind of target somebody and say, oh, I know they're going to be at this meeting, I'm going to go, right? And that makes it a lot easier than having to just pick up the phone. So I think it's whatever your comfort level is, because a lot of people really are afraid of the phone.
Yeah. So you can send an email to warm it up. And for me, I find it is very helpful if people are on different channels of communication and they have a strong preference towards one thing over another. Some people are very responsive on emails. Other people, their email box is overflowing and they're highly responsive on LinkedIn. So don't disregard the idea of reaching out to a person on day one, with an email, day 2 through a LinkedIn connection, letting them know, hey, I sent you an email, but I'm not sure if you saw that. And I actually go LinkedIn first, email second, and then phone call third, where you might leave a voicemail if you don't get directly through. If you want to triple your probability of getting through on a phone call between the hours of 7:30 to 8:15 a.m. their time. People answer their phones at that time way more frequently than any other time of the day. So,
or 4 o'clock.
Or 4 o'clock.
If they're a high level, high powerful person, they're usually working late.
Yep. So somewhere around 4 o'clock their time. So if I'm talking to people on the East Coast, I have to be mindful of it. So those are, you have to think about all the different channels and steps. Connecting through on other things like Facebook and Instagram for certain people can also work, but the 3 basics there will usually get you some kind of conversation. In your own mind, your mindset has to be about convicted in, and I don't mean that in the bad way, really determined that I need to be talking to this person. I have important things to talk to them about, just as if it were anybody else that you had a long-term strong relationship with. You wouldn't expect them to blow you off. And similarly, you need to be of that sort of a mindset with these other people that you're trying to reach out to, that you have to know that what you're saying or what you want to talk to them about is of importance. So
that keeps it from being salesy. That's right. Perfect.
Yes, you can't be thinking about, I'm going to talk to them about how great I am and what amazing skills I have and why I should be on their board, because they really don't care about that. It's not helpful. And you guys know this, you hear me preach about it all the time. And then when you start getting into those gatekeepers, as Shelley said, you can easily forge relationships with them and view them as your advocate instead of your adversary. Get on their good side and do not be rude to them. That's obvious. But more importantly, be friendly, go the other way. Having casual conversations with them, because by the way, nobody else does that either. They assume you are the gatekeeper and you're only good for being a gatekeeper and not as a real person. So talk to them as a real person, get to know them. And then we're going to come into the urgency part of it. But I think, Shelley, we did have a great point from Bruce about the whole liability and risk associated with board membership. Do you want to start in on that? And then we'll have Bruce comment on it too, because I think he's had some personal experience.
You really need to understand board governance and your legal liabilities when you're joining a board. Something that you mentioned earlier, Patrice, consulting work as an advisory, probably not going to happen. You're either a paid advisor board member or you're a consultant. You're not going to generally be both, because that would sort of cross those boundaries of being a paid board advisor versus a consultant. So there are going to be some specific rules that you need to verse yourself on. And in fact, actually, if you want to look at the Morgan Stanley's philanthropic board governance section, it's very, very detailed. It's for nonprofit work, but it's probably going to be very similar across the board for private and smaller based companies. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about what Bruce has to say.
Yeah, I love your conflict of interest there that you're bringing up, board member versus internal person. Yeah, great point. Bruce.
Couple of things. I mean, there's some basic things. Don't ever look at joining a board where the company or entity involved doesn't have appropriate directors and officers coverage. The D&O coverage only goes so far. You have to really dig in and understand the risk profile of the company itself. So in the for-profit world, that for me, that's meant understanding who the shareholders are and what, in my view, or the view of other folks who know the company, what the risks associated with the company are. So I've never been sued, but I've been threatened by shareholders as a board member. The older I've gotten, those kind of threats don't scare me as much as they did when I was younger. But it's out there. And all it takes is one dissident shareholder with a deep pocket, and they can cause real hell for you as a board member, whether you get sued or not. And so just make sure that you understand the situation that you're getting in and rely a lot on people who know the company, people you can talk to and understand not only the leadership of the company, but the shareholder profile and who the shareholders are, and in some cases, who the customers or potential customers are. So watch that closely. By joining a board, you are exposing yourself to liability, whether you think you are or not.
Bruce, thank you. That's really helpful, especially for those of us that haven't been on these public boards. It feels like a topic or a category in itself. I'd love to almost understand how you would dive into some of those issues and some of the very specific questions that you would ask and the red flags that you might look for. That seems like a whole session in itself.
Yeah, Bruce is bringing up a great point. And there's a variation along that theme line there of when you're dealing with startups that are under $1 million in annual revenues, having shareholders is going to be the usually owner founder. And then if there's a board, an advisory board that's been put into place, they may have some less than total 10% impact on the company as shareholders as well. So things to look for are going to be things like bylaws in place, and you get your copy of it to read, and then equity shareholder agreements to understand that. A cap table will tell you who the people are and what percentage each has. So these are documents that even in a privately held, not of course in a publicly held, that's a whole nother level of sophistication. But if we even restrict our conversation and focus even on just privately held boards, when they're under $1 million and they are pre-seed, so they haven't done a round of funding yet, they are not likely to have many of these documents in place, or they'll be fairly rudimentary. Then as they go into their first round of funding, and they won't have these documents necessarily, even if they've done a friends and family round, they'll have more like safe agreements or different kinds of instruments for the fiduciary piece of it, but they won't have necessarily all the other governance types of things that Shelley's referring to. So these are things to begin to ask for, is just, any documents that you might have, and that would be bylaws and equity shareholder agreements and things of that nature. And then as you progress and read through those and learn to read them, they are a little bit complicated. There are a lot of legalese to it. Then you can understand these risks that Bruce is pointing out. And in there specifically, you're looking for a clause around indemnification of the board members. And then also Bruce is pointing out a specific insurance policy that would be in place. And to his point about risk, in his case, he's dealing with a lot more in the medical space. So anything in medical device, et cetera, it's life-threatening. And the risk is a lot higher than if you're dealing with something that's like software, software as a service kind of a thing. Not as nearly as much risk for the most part. That's just a little bit of background for you to have some things to ask for would be, do you have your basic documents of governance or entity structure type of documents? That'll get you started. Shelley, other thoughts or ideas on any of that from your Morgan Stanley governance?
No, I just think that Bruce is right. When you take a board position, even for early stage companies, if you get seed investors, they are your stakeholders. So you do want to make sure that the things that you guys are deciding on as the board are not harming either the company or people who you're reporting to. So that's kind of your job, right? So that was a really good point.
Right.
And it's always the 1% guy.
Yes, so true. Don, I wanted to come back to your point about gatekeepers. I've had a lot of people ask those questions around that. So you mentioned that you had another idea of getting around gatekeepers. And as someone who is a seasoned business development person, tell us a little bit about that.
over the years, being in sales, that's the one thing that you always do is you have to get around gatekeepers to get to the key decision makers. And so in my past, I worked closely with many of the Fortune 500 companies, and my role was to make contact with some of the C-suite executives within those organizations. And those big organizations, there's multiple layers of gatekeepers to get to the C-suite sometimes. And so one of the things that I did that was almost 100% getting in contact with those key decision makers was I developed what I called a power letter. And essentially what I did was I drafted a letter, and in that letter stated exactly why I wanted to make connection with them, and talked about why my product or my service or whatever solution I had was going to be a benefit for their organization. There's so many ways that we can communicate with people, and we all get inundated with a million emails. I thought, what would stand out to a C-level executive? And so what I did was I put that letter and maybe a sample of my product or something in it, and I put it in a FedEx envelope, and I put my business card, whatever, and I sent that directly to the C-suite executive in a FedEx envelope overnight. Now it does cost, I don't remember, 10, 12, 15 bucks, whatever, to send it. But I can tell you that 100% of the time I got a response from that C-level executive just by doing it that way. Because how often do you get, and I say this, how often does a C-level executive or any of us get a FedEx envelope specifically, addressed to you? There's a curiosity level that goes along with that. When you get it, you say, well, I don't even know who this person is, but what is this? They open it and they look at it and they read it. And I had almost 100% every time.
I'd say you must have had a pretty compelling message in your letter too.
Yeah. And it was what I call the top to top kind of letter, where the reason we're reaching out to you is our executive management team, or if I was in that role, I would say, as a VP of sales or whatever, I'm reaching out to you because we truly feel we have a product or service that is going to benefit you. And just one example, I did this with Costco, with the CEO of Costco, and the guy called me immediately. Wow. and put me in contact with his marketing folks, who ultimately would be the people I would end up working with. But at the end of the day, it opens some doors and gets you immediately around the gatekeeper, because when it's addressed specifically to them, how often does the gatekeeper open the individual's mail?
Right. Especially at FedEx. Yeah. With COVID, of course, and remote workforce, this becomes a little bit more difficult to execute on because everybody's at their home offices or some unknown place. So it can be a little bit more challenging, but the point still stands to figure that out and do your best to send some kind of lumpy mail to them. That lumpy mail stuff works like magic. It truly does. All these great ideas. Let's see if there's any other questions here. We're coming up to 9:30, so we're right at the end of our time. So any last questions? Don mentioned something about using industry trade shows for gathering information. Don, what's the question there? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, Dominic is saying, looking at industries and to target an industry to serve a board on. And I got to thinking and said, well, what one location could you go find a whole bunch of information about companies in that industry? And it would be an industry trade show.
Gotcha. Yeah. And you could definitely get that off of the industry trade show websites to see who are the companies, who are the people involved, all tons and tons of information. Great approach to that. Shelley, any other final words on what we've been talking about today?
No, just great to see everybody. And you guys feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'm happy to help, and really good to see everybody again.
Yes. And we'll see you guys October 5th in our last session on this part 3, where we're going to wrap up about what does your board resume need to have. And Colleen, to your point, we do have a little bit on governance in there as well. So with your resume, it's about what should you expect in the informal interviewing process around board stuff. So not only the resume, but what are the questions you should ask? What are the questions they will be asking you? How should you answer those? And then included in that is a little bit more on governance and in the key questions you should be talking about. So we'll look forward to seeing all of you October 5th. Sign up, register. It's online. If you have questions, let me know, let Shelley know. And again, thanks everybody. Great session.